watched in shock as her father handed everything to Hazel, his stepdaughter, saying she was more deserving. But Grandma had left Ava something far more valuable than anyone knew, a secret inheritance that would change everything. As Ava discovered the truth her grandmother had hidden, she realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't fought with anger, but with dignity and patience. I stood frozen in the lawyer's office, watching my father sign the transfer papers with steady hands. Each stroke of his pen felt like a knife cutting through whatever bond we had left. The estate my grandmother had spent her life building, her beautiful home, her savings, her precious jewelry collection, was all being transferred to Hazel, his stepdaughter. When I finally found my voice to protest, he looked me straight in the eye with a coldness I'd never seen before. "Hazel is more deserving than you," he said, his words sharp and final. I watched Vanessa, his wife, place a hand on my shoulder with fake sympathy. The moment I turned away, I caught her reflection in the window. She was smirking. Tears burned down my cheeks as the reality hit me. My father had chosen his new family over his own blood. I walked out of that office clutching a sealed envelope that Grandma had secretly slipped into my hand at her funeral, my only comfort in that moment of complete betrayal. My name is Ava Rowan, and my father taught me that love can have conditions. I was 12 years old when my mother died in a car accident, leaving me and my father alone in our grief. I remembered crying myself to sleep for months, clutching the ruby necklace she'd always worn. My father seemed lost without her, wandering through our house like a ghost. Then, less than a year after we buried her, he remarried. Vanessa swept into our lives with her daughter Hazel in tow, promising to heal our broken family. At first, Hazel seemed sweet, shy smiles and quiet hellos. But slowly, like water eroding stone, she began replacing me in everything. She got my father's attention at dinner. She received his affection when I used to. One day, I came home from school to find she'd been moved into my bedroom because it had better light. I was relocated to the smaller guest room. Nobody asked me how I felt about it. Vanessa played her role perfectly, the concerned stepmother who only wanted harmony. But behind closed doors she was different. She'd tell my father that my attitude was causing problems, that I was making it hard for them to blend as a family. My father started believing her version of events over mine. When I won a scholarship for academic excellence, Vanessa called it lucky timing. When Hazel got a B- in art class, suddenly she was gifted and talented. I watched my achievements get minimized while Hazel's were celebrated with dinner parties. The inequality was suffocating, but complaining only made me look bitter. So I stopped complaining. Instead, I started saving every cent I earned from part-time jobs, dreaming of the day I could move out and breathe freely again. One afternoon, I overheard Vanessa calling me ungrateful to my father in the kitchen. Before I could walk away, Grandma appeared beside me. She'd heard everything. She gave me a knowing look and whispered, "She doesn't know what I've arranged for you." After that day, Grandma started spending more time with me. We'd bake cookies in her kitchen on weekends, the warm smell of vanilla filling her cottage. We talked late into the night about everything. School, dreams, the way the world worked. She never made me feel small or unwanted. One quiet evening, as we sat on her porch watching the sunset, she told me something I'd never forget. "If people show you who they are, believe them," she said softly. "But never lose your kindness, Ava. That's what makes you stronger than they'll ever be." Then she added something that confused me at the time. "When I'm gone, follow your heart and the truth, not the will." I asked her what she meant, but she just smiled mysteriously and changed the subject. I didn't understand then. I didn't know she was already sick, already planning something bigger than I could imagine. A few months later, I got the call that Grandma had passed away unexpectedly. My world shattered all over again. At Grandma's funeral, Vanessa took charge of everything, choosing the flowers, directing the guests, organizing the reception. She pushed me aside whenever I tried to help, treating me like an inconvenient stranger. I spent most of the service crying silently in the back row, feeling more alone than ever. During the final viewing, as I stood by Grandma's casket saying my private goodbye, an elderly woman approached me. I recognized her as one of Grandma's oldest friends. She pressed a small envelope into my palm, closing my fingers around it. "She told me to give you this privately," she whispered urgently, glancing around to make sure nobody was watching. "Don't let anyone else see it." I nodded and quickly tucked it into my jacket pocket, my heart pounding. Something about the secrecy felt important, sacred even. 2 days later, the lawyer called requesting a family meeting to read the will. I had no idea my world was about to collapse even further. The lawyer's office felt cold and formal as we gathered around his large mahogany desk. He opened the official document and began reading in that monotone voice lawyers use. The entire estate, Grandma's house, her savings, her jewelry, was being left to the family, which legally meant my father as her only child. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the will. But Hazel's name appeared as a future beneficiary, listed right beside mine in a clause about grandchildren. My heart dropped into my stomach. Vanessa's smile grew wider with each word the lawyer read. When I questioned why my name was barely included, my father snapped at me in front of everyone. "Your grandmother wanted Hazel to have a chance too," he said, his tone defensive and angry. "Stop being selfish, Ava." I couldn't breathe. I left before I completely broke down, ignoring Vanessa's false sympathy. Outside in my car, I finally remembered the envelope. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter in Grandma's familiar looping script, along with a small silver key. I recognized that key immediately. It opened her old studio. The letter read, "My dearest Ava, if you're reading this, they've already taken what they think is yours. But the real inheritance is somewhere they'd never look. Go to the place where I taught you to stand tall. Trust yourself, trust the key, and remember, you are worth more than their judgment. All my love, Grandma." Tears streamed down my face as I read it 3 times. The place where she taught me to stand tall. I knew exactly where that was. When I was younger, Grandma had an art studio in the back garden of her property. She taught me to paint there, always telling me to stand tall on the step stool so I could reach the top of the canvas. That night, after everyone had left, I drove back to Grandma's property and snuck into the garden. The studio stood dark and abandoned at the edge of the property. I used the silver key, and the lock clicked open easily. Inside, everything was covered in white sheets, untouched and dusty. Moonlight filtered through the dirty windows, casting strange shadows across the room. I moved carefully through the space, remembering afternoons spent here with Grandma. Behind an old painting of a meadow, I found what I was looking for: a wooden chest. With an ornate shock as her father handed everything to Hazel. Inside were stacks of old documents, saying she was more certificates of authenticity. But Grandma had left Ava something far more valuable than anyone knew: property deed, a secret inheritance that would change as I pulled out the deed. As Ava discovered the truth her grandmother had hidden, purchased 20 years ago, that sometimes the best revenge isn't fought as the sole legal owner, but with dignity. Grandma had transferred it to me years ago. I stood frozen in the lawyer's office, completely separate from her estate, watching my father sign the transfer papers with one more envelope. Each stroke of his pen felt like a knife cutting through whatever bond we had left. The envelope contained a business card for a lawyer named Mr. Building, along with a note telling me to contact him immediately. Her precious jewelry collection. The next morning, I called his office and arranged a secret meeting. When I finally found my older gentleman with kind eyes, he looked me straight in the eye with a coldness I'd never seen before. He explained that Grandma had created a completely separate trust for me, his words sharp of her main estate. I watched Vanessa, substantial savings, place a hand on my shoulder with fake sympathy. The moment I turned away, I caught her reflection in the window. I couldn't access the full trust until I turned 21. As the reality hit me. Your grandmother was very specific. My father had chosen his new family over his own blood. She wanted you to be old enough to handle this sealed envelope that Grandma had secretly slipped into my hand at her funeral. I did the math in my head. My only comfort in that moment of complete betrayal. My 21st birthday was only 3 months away. My name is Ava Rowan. 3 months of pretending I had nothing while my father and his new family celebrated when my mother died in a car accident. Could wait 3 months, leaving me and my father alone in our grief. I
Meanwhile,
remembered
back at
crying
home,
myself to sleep
my
for
father
months,
and Vanessa threw an
clutching the
elaborate
ruby
celebration
necklace
for
for
Hazel's
Hazel's
inheritance.
My father seemed
They
lost
invited
without
friends,
her,
distant
wandering
relatives,
through our
everyone
house
they
like a
wanted to
ghost.
impress.
Then,
I
less
watched
than a
from the
year
doorway
after
as
we
Hazel
buried
paraded
her,
around
remarried.
wearing Grandma's
Vanessa
jewelry,
swept into our
taking
lives
photos
with her
for
daughter
social
Hazel
media.
in tow.
She posted
Promising
pictures
to
of
heal
herself
our
draped
broken
in pearls and gemstones.
At first, Hazel
captioning
seemed
them
sweet,
with sentimental
shy
messages
smiles
about
and
honoring
quiet hellos.
Grandma's memory.
But slowly,
Each post
like
made
water
me sick,
eroding
but I
stone,
stayed silent.
she began
I knew the
replacing
truth
me in
now,
everything.
and that
She got
knowledge
my
became my
father's
shield.
attention at dinner.
My dignity
She
became my
received
weapon.
his affection
I
when
attended
used
the
to.
party wearing a
One
simple
day,
dress.
I came home from
smiled
school to
politely
find she'd
when
been
people
moved
offered
into my bedroom
condolences
because it had
and
better
said
light.
nothing about what
I
I
was
discovered.
relocated to
Let
the
them
smaller
have their
guest
moment.
room.
Let
Nobody
them
asked
think
me
they
how I
won.
felt about
My
it.
time was coming.
Vanessa played her
Then
role
Hazel made a
perfectly.
mistake.
The concerned
She posted a
stepmother
photo
who
wearing
only
a
wanted
ruby
harmony,
necklace that I
but behind
immediately
closed
recognized.
doors she was different.
It wasn't part of
She'd tell my
Grandma's
father that
collection
my
at all.
attitude was
The ruby
causing
necklace
problems,
in Hazel's
that I was making
Instagram
it hard for
photo
them to
belonged
blend
to my
as a
mother.
family.
I'd
My father
recognized it
started
anywhere.
believing her
The
version of
specific way the
events
stones
over
were
mine.
set.
When
The
I won a
delicate
scholarship
gold
for
chain.
academic
It
excellence,
had been in my mother's
Vanessa
jewelry
called
box,
it lucky
locked away
timing.
since her death.
When Hazel got
it
a
wasn't
B-
part of
in art
Grandma's
class,
estate because
suddenly
it had
she
never
was
been Grandma's
gifted
to
and
give.
talented.
Someone had
I
taken
watched
it
my
from
achievements
things.
get minimized
I confronted
while
my
Hazel's
father
were
the next
celebrated
morning,
with dinner parties.
showing him the photo
The
on my
inequality
phone.
was suffocating.
But
He barely
complaining
glanced
only
at
made me
it
look
before
bitter.
waving me off.
So I stopped
Your
complaining.
mother wanted her jewelry
Instead,
to
I
stay
started
in the
saving
family,
every cent I
he
earned
said
from part-time
dismissively.
jobs.
The
Dreaming
audacity
of
of
the
his
day I could
words
move
hit
out
me
and
like a
breathe
slap.
freely again.
It was in the
One
family,
afternoon,
I said,
I overheard
my voice
Vanessa
shaking with
calling me
anger.
ungrateful
It was
to my
mine.
father in the kitchen.
She left it to me.
Before I could walk
He sighed
away,
like I was being
Grandma
dramatic.
appeared beside
We're
me.
all family
She'd
now,
heard
Ava.
everything.
Stop
She gave
being
me a knowing
possessive.
look and whispered.
That's when Vanessa
She doesn't
walked
know
in,
what I've
saw
arranged
us
for you.
arguing, and
After
sneered.
that day, Grandma
You're being
started spending
ungrateful
more time
trash.
with me, she spat.
We'd bake
Cookies
after
in her
everything
kitchen on
we've done
weekends.
for you.
The
I
warm
waited
smell
for my
of
father
vanilla
to
filling
defend
her
me,
cottage.
to say something,
We talked
anything,
late into the night
but
about
he just
everything.
looked away.
That night, I
dreams,
packed
the
my
way the
bags
world
in
worked.
silence.
She never
No
made
yelling,
me feel
no
small
dramatic
or
scene,
unwanted.
no goodbye speech.
One quiet evening,
I simply
as we
gathered
sat
my
on her
belongings,
porch watching the
what
sunset,
little remained that was
she
actually
told me
mine,
something I'd never
and
forget.
loaded them into my
If
car.
people show you who
I
they
left a
are,
note on the
believe
kitchen
them,
counter
she said
saying
softly.
I was moving out.
But never
Nothing
lose your
more.
kindness,
Then I
Ava.
drove away
That's
from that
what
house
makes you
forever,
stronger than they'll
feeling
ever
lighter
be.
with each mile.
Then she added something
I
that
moved
confused
into the
me
lake
at the
house
time.
that Grandma
When
had
I'm
left
gone,
me.
follow
It
your
needed
heart
work.
and the truth.
The paint was
not the
peeling.
will.
Some windows
I
were
asked her
cracked.
what she
the
meant,
garden was overgrown.
but she just smiled
But it was
mysteriously
mine,
and
truly
changed
mine.
the subject.
I spent
I
weeks
didn't
fixing it up
understand
room
then.
by room.
I didn't know
painting
she was
walls,
already
repairing
sick,
fixtures,
already
making it a
planning
home.
something bigger
For the
than
first
I could
time
imagine.
in years, I felt
A few
peace.
months later,
felt free.
I got the call that
I could
Grandma
breathe
had
without
passed
someone
away
judging my every
unexpectedly.
move.
My world
I didn't
shattered
tell
all over
anyone
again.
where I was.
At Grandma's
Let them
funeral,
wonder.
Vanessa took
Then,
charge
2
of
weeks
everything.
before my birthday,
Choosing the
Mr.
flowers,
Doran
directing
called
the
with
guests,
surprising news.
organizing the reception.
The trust was
She
larger
pushed
than
me
anyone
aside
had
whenever
imagined.
I tried to help.
I sat in
treating
Mr.
me like
Doran's
an
office
inconvenient
as he explained
stranger.
the full
I
extent
spent
of what
most of the
Grandma had
service
left
crying
me.
silently
The
in the
investment
back
she'd
row,
made decades
feeling
ago had
more
grown
alone than
exponentially.
During
We
the
were
final
talking about
viewing,
millions
as I
of
stood by
dollars.
Grandma's
But that
casket
wasn't
saying my
all.
private goodbye,
Among the documents,
an elderly woman
he showed
approached
me
me.
proof of an
I
extensive
recognized her
art
as one of
portfolio.
Grandma's
Grandma
oldest
had
friends.
been creating and
She
selling
pressed a
paintings
small
under a
envelope
pseudonym
into
for
my
years,
palm,
building
closing
a
my fingers
reputation in
around
certain
it.
art circles.
She told me to give
Some
you
of her
this
pieces
privately.
were now considered
She whispered
collector's
urgently,
items, glancing
worth
around to make
substantial
sure
amounts.
nobody was watching.
She'd been quietly
Don't let
brilliant,
anyone else see
supporting
it.
herself
I
and
nodded
planning
and
my
quickly
future
tucked it
without
into my
anyone
jacket
knowing.
pocket.
She
My heart
started this
pounding.
trust the day
Something
you were
about
born,
the secrecy
Mr.
felt
Doran told
important,
me.
sacred
She
even.
always knew
2
you'd
days
need it
later,
someday.
the lawyer
I
called
cried in his
requesting
office,
a family meeting to read
overwhelmed
the
by
will.
Grandma's
I
love
had no
and
idea
foresight.
my world was about to
Meanwhile,
collapse
I started
even further.
noticing articles
The lawyer's
online
office
about
felt
my
cold
father's
and formal
company.
as we
He
gathered
was in
around his
financial
large
trouble.
mahogany desk. His business was
He
struggling
opened the
and he
official
was drowning
document
in
and
debt.
began began reading
Over
in
the
that
following
monotone
weeks,
voice lawyers
I
used.
watched from a distance
The entire
as my
estate,
father's life
Grandma's
unraveled.
house, her savings,
Vanessa's
her
jewelry
lavish spending
was
had
being
caught
left
up
to
with
the
them.
family.
She'd been
which
using
legally
credit
meant my
cards,
father as
taking
her only
loans,
child.
living far
My
beyond
name
their
wasn't
means.
mentioned
Hazel
anywhere
had
in the
dropped
will.
out of college,
But Hazel's
supposedly
name
to
appeared
help
as
the
a future
family business.
beneficiary.
But she had
Listed
no idea
right
what she
beside
was
mine
doing.
in a clause
The
about
company was
grandchildren.
hemorrhaging money.
My heart dropped into
Articles
my
appeared
stomach.
in local business
Vanessa's
sections
smile
about
grew wider
potential
with
bankruptcy.
each word the lawyer read.
Part of me felt
When I
a twinge
questioned
of
why
pity.
my name was barely
He
included.
was still my father
My father
after
snapped
all.
at me in
But
front of
another
everyone.
part of me felt
Your
vindicated.
grandmother wanted Hazel to have a
He
chance
chosen
to,
them over
he
me,
said,
called me undeserving,
his tone defensive
and now
angry.
he was facing the
Stop
consequences
being
of aligning
selfish, Ava.
himself with people
I
who
couldn't
only cared
breathe.
about money.
I left
Then
before I
one
completely
evening my
broke
phone
down,
buzzed with a message
ignoring
from
Vanessa's
Hazel.
false sympathy.
Can we talk? Outside in
Please.
my car.
It's urgent.
I finally remembered
I stared
the
at the
envelope.
message for a
My
long time,
hands shook as I tore it
debating
open.
whether to respond.
Inside was a
Finally,
handwritten letter in
curiosity
Grandma's familiar
I agreed
looping
to meet
script,
her at a neutral
along
location.
with a small silver key.
Hazel showed up
I
at the coffee
recognized
shop
that
looking
key
terrible.
immediately.
Dark
It
circles
opened her
under
old
her
studio,
eyes,
hair
the letter
unwashed,
read,
clothes
My
wrinkled.
dearest Ava,
She was
if you're
crying
reading
before
this,
she even
they've
sat
already
down.
taken what they
For
think
an
is
hour,
yours.
she poured out
But the
everything.
real inheritance
She told
is
me how
somewhere
Vanessa
they'd
had
never
forged
look.
some of
Go
Grandma's
to the place
documents
where
to
I
secure
taught you
the
to stand
inheritance
tall.
early.
Trust
How
yourself.
she pressured
Trust
Hazel
the
to
key
sign
and
papers
remember,
she didn't understand.
You are worth more
Dad
than their
doesn't
judgment.
know.
Hazel
All my
insisted,
love,
sobbing.
Grandma. Mom
Tears
made me do
streamed
it.
down my face
She said
as I
it was
read
just
it 3
legal
times.
paperwork.
The
The
place
place
where she
mean
taught me to
anything.
stand tall.
But I realized
I knew
now
exactly
what I
where that
signed.
was.
I
When I was
recorded
younger,
everything on my phone,
Grandma had an
which she
art
didn't
studio
notice.
in the back
I
garden
wasn't
of her
sure if
property.
I believed her
She
claim
taught me
that
to
my
paint
father
there,
was innocent,
always telling me to
He'd been
stand
willfully
tall
blind
on the
at
step
best.
stool so I
But
could reach
Hazel
the top of
seemed
the canvas.
genuinely scared of
That
her mother
night,
now.
after everyone had
Genuinely
left,
remorseful.
I drove back to
She's going
Grandma's
to ruin
property
everything,
and snuck into the
Hazel
garden.
whispered.
The studio
business,
stood
the
dark
house,
and abandoned
everything.
at the edge
I
of the
thanked her
property.
for telling me and
I
left.
used the silver key
That evening,
and the lock
I
clicked
sent the
open
recording
easily.
directly to Mr.
Inside,
Doran.
everything was
Mr.
covered in
Doran
white
acted
sheets,
quickly,
untouched and dusty.
He alerted the
Moonlight
estate
filtered
board
through
through
the
the dirty
potential
windows,
fraud,
providing
casting
the
strange
recording as
shadows
evidence.
across the room.
Within days,
I moved carefully
all
through
accounts
the space,
related to Grandma's
remembering
estate
afternoons
were frozen
spent
pending
here with
investigation.
Behind
My
an
father
old painting
panicked
of a
when he
meadow,
couldn't
I
access
found
the
what I
funds
was
he'd been
looking
using
for,
to cover
a
business
wooden
expenses.
chest. Vanessa scrambled to explain herself, trying to pin the blame entirely on Hazel. She claimed Hazel had acted alone, that she knew nothing about any forged documents. But the investigators found Vanessa's signatures on everything.
Hazel's
Watched in shock
testimony,
as her father
combined
handed
with
the
the
evidence,
evidence,
Hazel
painted
painted
a
a
clear
clear
picture
picture
of
manipulation
and
fraud.
certificates of
For the first
authenticity
time,
various
Hazel
artworks.
saw
Ava
her mother's
something
more
more valuable
valuable
than
than
anyone
anyone
knew.
knew.
Vanessa would
A
throw her
secret
own
inheritance
hands
that
that
would
trembled
change
as I
everything.
pulled out the
Then
deed.
Ava
Ava
discovered
discovered
listed
her
a lake
grandmother
house
had
property.
they needed me to
Purchased
20
25
years ago.
ago.
Grandma's
Sometime in the
intense
venture
revenge
Ava
family
family as the
dynamics.
sole legal owner.
But trial date was
Grandma
set
had
for
2 weeks
weeks away.
away.
I stood
years
frozen
ago
in the lawyer's
completely
office,
separate
felt
from
watching
her
my
estate.
father sign
at the bottom of
one
one
table
table
with
was
his
one
own
hand,
envelope.
looking
Each
older
stroke
and
of
more
his
tired
hand
than
felt
I
like
could.
a
For the
knife
attorney
cutting
you can
through
trust.
whatever
Vanessa
bond
sat
we
the
had
envelope
left
contained
beside
the
him.
estate my
Her
grandmother
face
amassed
masked
after
the
building
composure.
along with
When my
home
telling
came
came
contact
to
of her
him,
precious
I
jewelry
walked to the
collection.
next morning.
Was
I
all
called
being
his office
transferred
and
to every
arranged a
question
secret
honestly.
meeting.
When
Mr.
I found
Doran
Grandma's
found an
relationship
relationship
test
with
about
kind
the
eyes.
secret
He looked
envelope
straight
stared
down the
at
eye
my
with
grandmother.
coldness I'd
I
never seen
explained
before.
how I'd been
Hazel
systematically
is more
decided
deserving
my
of
own
being
family,
separate
he said.
trust for
How
me.
Vanessa
His
had
word
manipulated
showed
her
her
situations
situation
to her
I
advantage.
watched
It included
Vanessa
under
stand
cross-examination,
place a hand on my
Vanessa's
shoulder
lawyer
and
tried
tried
to
to
make me
me
seem bitter.
The moment
and
I
turned
turned
away,
away,
I
but
caught
there was a
reflection
condition.
window.
I
She
couldn't
could
access
access
the full
signatures,
trust
the
and
manipulating
manipulating
documents
documents
as the
the
fraudulent
Your
claims.
grandmother was
My
very
father had
unraveled
chosen his
under
new
Mr.
family
Doran
over his own
The
blood.
judge ruled
She
I
wanted
walked
you
out
to
of
be
that
strong
office
enough
to
to handle
handle
this
this
responsibility.
responsibility. Grandma
Away
had
from
secretly
everything
found
was
my
to be
hand at her
reinstated
funeral. I did the
according to
math.
Grandma's
My
comfort in that
actual
moment
wishes,
of complete
which the
betrayal
separate
was
trust
only
my
3
name
months
was
away.
Ava Rowan.
3
And my
months
father
after
taught me
telling
that
I had
nothing
nothing
had
while my father
conditions
and his
swarmed
new
I was
family
12 years
celebrated
old
when
when
my
my
mother
mother
died in a car
The
accident.
news
Wait
spread
3 months,
leaving me
through
and
I'd
my
already
father
alone
alone
in
in
our
our
Vanessa's
I
reputation
remember
shattered
crying
overnight.
myself to
My
sleep. She
father
was
and
exposed
Vanessa
as a
clutching
fraud
elaborate
who
manipulation
manipulated
for his
Hazel's
widow's
inheritance.
estate. My father
Hazel
seeing
invited
invited
friends,
friends, all
distant
social
relatives.
wandering through our
Everyone
house
laid
later
it
by
to
the
the
public
press.
fallout.
Then,
I
less
watched
than a
my
year
father's
away
business
as
Hazel
partners
paraded
disputes
around
marriage.
wearing Grandma's
Vanessa
jewelry,
swept
into
into
our
our
lives
lives
with
with
her
her
daughter
daughter
Hazel
Hazel
in
in
tow.
Contracts
She
were
posted
terminated
pictures
to
of
heal
herself
our broken
draped in
family.
pearls and
Within a
gemstones.
month,
He
Hazel
had
seeing
forced
them
to
with
file for
sentimental
bankruptcy
messages
smiles
about
and
honor admire
at all.
Grandma's
I remained
memory.
but
Silent.
slowly,
Each post
like
I
water
didn't give
eroding
into, but I
stone
stayed
or make
silent.
public
She began
statements.
I knew the truth.
I
in
chose
everything.
grace
And
over
that she got
knowledge
my
became my
father's
attention
attention
over
at
my
dinner.
dignity
She
became my
received
weapon.
his affection
I
when I
attended
used
the
it
party
from the
wearing
fact.
a
One
simple
day,
dress.
I came
focused
home
on
from
rebuilding
school
politely
politely
when
when
they
they
moved
offered
into
to
my
be
bedroom
away
because
from
it had
the
better
said
light.
nothing about
Then
when I was
relocated
after
to
the
the
trial
trial.
a letter
moment.
arrived in my
Nobody
mailbox
asked me
saying
how I felt
it was
about
from
it.
my
Time was
father.
coming.
Vanessa played her
Then
role
Hazel made a
perfectly.
mistake.
The
She
concern
wanted to
posted
take
a
a
photo
who
where I
only wanted
debated
to
ignoring
hide
it,
that I
but
immediately
behind
made
closed
curious
doors
enough
she
to
was
respond.
It wasn't part of
She told
Grandma's
my father
culture
that my
outside
attitude
of town
was
the ruby
somewhat
necklace
quiet
in
and
Hazel's
that I was making
Instagram
it hard for
photo
them
belonged
to
to my
warn
family.
Like
my
father
everything
had
believing
finally
her
broken
version of
the way the
events
stones
were
were
set.
I made
When
a
I won a
scholarship
scholarship
for academic. It had been in my mother's
I
jewelry
thought I was
closet,
protecting the
locked
family,
away since
keeping
her
us
death.
together.
When Hazel got
It
to be
wasn't
part
part
of
of
grandma's
what was really
estate
happening.
because
Suddenly
it
she
had never
was
stirred my
gifted
coffee
and
and letting him
talented.
talk.
Someone had
I
taken
watched
it
my
from my
achievements
parents.
get minimized.
I confronted
while
my
Hazel's
father
were
the
celebrating
next
over
dinner
mine,
parties,
showing him the
for letting
photo
inequality
on
was
was
suffocating.
But
saying
he
I
barely
was
glanced at
unpathetic
me
before
before
waving
each
me on.
apology
So I
felt
stopped
both
Your
plain
mother
bait
wanted
and
her
somehow
jewelry
necessary.
I started saving
When
every
he
cent
finished,
I
I
earned
spoke
part-time
quietly.
jobs.
The
The audacity
audacity
of
of
his
his
words
words
hit
moved
me
out
like
and
I
breathed
told
freely
him
again.
It
You
was
were
in one
protecting
afternoon,
your family.
I
My
overheard
voice
Vanessa
echoed
calling
through
me
me
ungrateful
was
to my
my
father in the
protected
kitchen.
she
left
and
it
you
to me.
before I could walk
He sighed
away.
like I was
He had
being
no
dramatic
response to
beside
that.
me.
We're all
The
family
truth
now
sounded
between
everything.
us like a living
She
thing.
gave me a
Possessing
knowing
look
look and
forgive him.
whispered.
That's when
Now
Vanessa
she
walked
doesn't
in.
know what
Maybe
I've
not
ever
saw
asked
us
for you,
arguing,
but I didn't
after
hate
that
him
day,
either.
Grandma's
Your
hate
behavior
required
too much
energy.
she spat.
We'd
Then
bake
he asked
cookies
the
and
question
everything
I
on
always done
weekends
for you.
Can you
I waited
smell
for
my
my
father
father
to
to
defend me?
I took a deep breath.
We talked late into the night,
but he just
looked
looked
away. Do you remember
That
what
night,
you
I
said
packed
in the
my
bags
bags
in
worse.
silence?
She never
No
made me
yelling,
feel
no
so
dramatic
dramatic.
Hazel
No
was more
goodbye
deserving
one
than
quiet
me.
evening
I simply
as we
gathered
sat
my
on
belongings,
belongings
watching
watching
his
the
own
sunset
words
being
being
quoted
quoted.
was
She told
actually
me
mine.
something I'd
I
never
reached
forget
into my
them into
bag
my
and
car.
pulled out an
I left
envelope
a note on the
prepared
kitchen
them.
counter
Now
saying
you'll
I
see
was
what that
moving
really
out.
means.
Never lose
Nothing
your
more.
kindness.
Then I
Saying it
drove
across
away
the
from
That's
that
what
house
makes you
forever.
stronger
She
than
opened it,
they'll
feeling
shaking
lighter
hands.
with each
Then
mile.
she added
Inside,
something
I
that
moved
checked
into the
large
lake
enough to
house
cover
that
his
Grandma
immediate
had
left
gone
me
and
keep
follow
it
your
afloat
lead
for
were
several
true.
months.
The paint was
Not
peeling.
but it wasn't
Some
signed
windows
I
were
asked her
cracked.
what she
The
meant.
garden
It
was
overgrown.
overgrown.
But she just
Hazel
smiled
rose
mysteriously
His
and
confusion
changed the
was
subject.
immediate.
I spent
I didn't
weeks
understand
understand
giving
them
you
by
my
room.
money. I didn't know
painting
she was
walls,
already
repairing
set. But Hazel
fixtures,
already
making
planning
it a home.
something
Genuinely,
bigger
for the
than I
first
could
time in
imagine.
years, I
She
felt
wanted
to
to
make
make
amends.
later.
Felt free.
I got
This
the
is
call
from
that
a grandma
Grandma
had
without
felt
telling
away
judging
judging
my
my
every move.
Away
My
from
world
the
shattered
tell
all
anyone
over
she
where I
asked
was.
me to
At
help
Grandma's
you.
funeral,
I
Vanessa
watched
took
them
charge of
everything
everything
for
on
my
his
birthday.
choosing the
Mr.
flowers
Doran
directly
I was
with his
surprising
organizing
not
the
with the
reception.
trust was
She
larger
pushed
than
me
anyone
aside
had
whenever
imagined.
I tried to help.
I sat in
treating
Mr.
the
Doran's
Dorans
office
as
as he
he
explained the
After
full
a
extent
meeting
of when
Grandma
Grandma
had
had
left
left
crying
me. Hazel had
silently in the
investment
background.
she'd made
Vanessa,
decades
feeling
ago
more
had grown
alone
to
with
a
small
small apartment.
During
And
the
we were
final
talking about
contact
millions
as I
of
stood
dollars.
by Grandma's
She
kitchen
reached out
saying
saying
a
private
goodbye.
goodbye.
This
Among
time
the
asking
documents
if we could try to build
he showed
something
me
new.
proof of
I
an
recognized
sisters,
her
but as
as
one
one
of
of
Grandma's Grandma had been creating and selling paintings.
I
Small
moved
envelopes
into
my
years.
palm.
We started
building
leading
reputations
around
around having careful
circles.
conversations.
She told me to give you this
pieces were now
boundaries that
considered
she whispered
collector's
urgently.
items. She was genuinely
Glancing
working
around
to make sure
nobody
going
was
to therapy.
watching.
She'd been quietly
Don't let
responsibility
anyone
for
else
her
supporting
actions.
herself.
I
And
nodded
together
at her
quickly
quickly
began
began
to
downstairs
into
Grandma's
pocket.
old art.
She
My
started
heart pounded
the
the
lake house.
the day
Something
you were
about
born.
the
Became a
secrecy
project
that
that connected us to Grandma's
She always
memory.
knew
2
to
days
be
later,
positive.
the lawyer
I
cried in
in
his
his
office
while
while
moving
moving
an
overwhelmed
cabinet
by
well.
Grandma's
I had
love
no
and
idea
my
my
world was
Meanwhile,
about to
there was a
collapse.
false
Started
wall
noticing
panel that
articles
neither of us
online
had
about
noticed
my
before.
father's company.
Behind
As we gathered
was
around
in
his
financial
large
trouble.
mahogany desk,
Carefully
his
wrapped
business
and
was
preserved.
struggling.
He opened the
We
official
both stared
document
at it
and
and
began
afraid
reading
over
in
the
that
following
something
voice
so
lawyers
deliberately
I watched
hidden.
from a
The
distance
entire
as my
my
father's
hands.
life,
Grandma's
Grandma's
house,
house, the
protective
protective
wrapping
lavish
from
spending
was
had
being
caught
left
up
to
with
the
the family.
family.
Took my
She'd
breath
been
away.
using
Legally
credit
my
cards
father
to
taken
taken
me
me
as
as
a
a
young
young
girl.
girl.
My name
7 or
wasn't
8 years
mentioned
old.
Hazel had dropped
holding
out
my
of
mother's
college,
ruby
but Hazel's name appeared as a future beneficiary. But she had
Grandma
listed
had
Raya
captured
captured
mine
everything
in a clause
perfect. The company
about
was on the back of the
grandchildren.
canvas.
My heart dropped
Articles
into my
appeared in
handwriting
local
was
business
Vanessa's
sections
smile
about
about
wider
potential
what they give
bankruptcy.
word the lawyer
It's
read.
what
Part
you
of me
build
felt
when
like
I
questioned
questioned
why my name
I
was
always
barely
saw your
included.
light,
Still my
Ava.
father.
My father
now make
smiled
sure
at
the
me
word
and
doesn't
Another part of me felt
Your
vindicated.
grandmother
wanted Hazel to have a
Tears
chance
streaming
them
down
over
my
me.
face.
Called me
Hazel
undeserving,
hugged me while I
and now
cried.
he was facing
Grandma had
being
planned all of
self-himself
every
with
step
people who only cared
She'd
about
known
money.
I'd find the
then
studio
one evening,
completely
my
broke
phone
down,
buzzed with a message
ignoring
from
She'd known
Vanessa's
I'd
false
need
these
these
reminders of my
outside
words
in my car.
everyone else
I'd
tried to
finally
diminish.
remembered
I
the
stared at the
next
message
day,
for a
my
long
hands
time,
shook as I
debating
open.
whether to
A
respond.
gallery side was a
finally
specialized
specialized
in
in
emerging
grandma's
artists.
familiar
Somehow
greetings
heard
with
about
her
grandma's
along with a
collection,
small
and
silver
contacted
Hazel
me
showed
about
up
I
in the coffee
recognized
shop
that
looking
key
terribly.
curator,
and
dark
dark
circles
circles
under
under
her
her
eyes.
knew her craft.
The letter
Unwashed,
read,
spent
clothes
hours
wrinkled.
examining
She was
grandma's
crying
paintings
before
before
she
she
even
even
sat
sat down.
She was amazed
for
by
an
the
hour
quality
she
and
poured
the
out
story
of the
behind
real
the work.
inheritance.
She told
She
me
somehow
how
was
Vanessa had
hosting an
forged some of
exhibition
grandma's
to go to the
art
place where I
security
taught her to
and
stand
real
tall.
early.
Trust
Finally
yourself,
giving
giving
her
her
the
recognition
recognition
and
she
remember,
deserved.
she didn't
We
understand.
worked
Work
together
together
for
for
my
doesn't
judgment.
know.
Preparing
All
the
my
exhibition.
love, grandma.
The opening
Tears
nightmares
streamed
do
down my
The
face
gallery
as I read
filled
with
with
art
lovers,
paperwork.
collectors,
That is
and
when she
me
taught me
even
to stand tall.
But I realized
work
now
was
finally
finally
being
being
seen and
I
celebrated.
recorded everything
I
on my
gave
phone.
Hazel
Had
a
an
front
art
row
studio
seat to
in the back
everything.
garden.
I wasn't
of
sure
if
if I
I believed
believed
her.
her
She
claim
told
that
me
my
my
father
father
was
was innocent.
Always
Vanessa
telling
tried
me
to
he'd been
stand
willfully
tall
blind
on
as
claiming
that
she
stool,
deserved
so I
to
but
be
Hazel
there
seemed
seemed
genuinely
genuinely
scared
scared.
to
Security
deny
denied
her
her
after
entry
everyone
based ongoing legal restriction. She's going to ruin everything. My father arrived quietly late and stood the house and abandoned in the back at the edge of the park for telling me I used the silver key that evening. And the lock he sent the recording directly to Mr. Inside. Everything was still celebrating a woman untouched for granted. He alerted me on whiteboard through the dirty window. After the exhibition ended, strange shadows across the room. Within days, my father approached all accounts related to Grandma's his apology spent pending investigation. Deeper, behind my father painting of a meadow, he apologized not because he wanted to cover a wooden chest, but because he finally understood what he'd lost. Explain herself. Your grandmother tried to blame me entirely on Hazel. She claimed Hazel had acted alone, that she knew nothing about any forged documents. But the investigators found Vanessa's signatures on everything. She tried to tell me about how I was treated as clear picture. I didn't say she was more certificates of authenticity. Hazel saw something and chose others over anyone knew. When I felt a secret in my hand not forgiveness exactly, then I really discovered listed a late they needed me to testify about Grandma's attempt to rebuild your life and now happiness. But trial date Grandma had transferred it to me years ago. I don't need to validate my watching my father sign at the bottom of the table was just as looking older and more tired, felt like he was cutting through Vanessa. The envelope contained the estate my grandfather made empty gallery. Along with my turn came contact of precious jewelry collection. The next morning I called his every question one final time. When I found Grandma's relationship about the secret envelope straight out the morning sun warm, I explained how I'd been seeing Hazel's more deserved my family trust for me. How Vanessa had always situations. You were right about Vanessa cross-examination. Place a hand on my shoulder and analyze wasn't the money, or the moment I turned away, but there was a self-worth. She taught me that my values doesn't lie down to anyone the fraudulent. Your grandmother was my father had chosen gently family over his own. The judge tracing her name walked out of distribution, touching a sound and fraudulent grandma away from everything was to be reinstated. I did the math. I turned that page my 21st betrayal. That rejection was Ava Rowan's. 3 months after that, I had nothing while my father and son was 12 years old. I did my mother died in a car accident. My phone had messages. I'd already waited near Vanessa's reputation. I remembered myself about a charity foundation clutching regulation always from Galileo. My father Hazel invited without all social wandering through our house and grandma had known. Then I watched my father's Hazel's paraded around wearing grandma's jewelry. We never had photos of Hazel in contracts were terminated. Pictures of herself draped in pearls and gemstones. Hazel portioning them with sentimental messages about and through grandma's remained but slowly, like water eroding but I stayed silent. She began. I knew the truth. I chose grace over God. She got my father's dignity over my dignity became my weapon of affection. I attended the party wearing a simple dress. I came home from rebuilding my life when the lake moved into my bedroom away because it had better said nothing about when I was relocated after the trial. Their letter arrived in my mailbox. Nobody asked me how I felt about my father. Vanessa played her Hazel made a mistake. The concern posted a photo where I debated ignoring it, that I had behind closed doors. She was different. It wasn't part of Grandma's color cafe outside of town. The ruby necklace in Hazel that I was making it hard for them. He looked worn down. Like my father studied her finding her specific way the stones were set. I made a scholarship for academic. It had been in my mother's jewelry. I thought I was protecting the family, keeping us together. When Hazel got a B part of Grandma was really happy because it had never been Grandma coffee and letting him talk. Someone had taken it from my achievements get minimized. I confronted my father celebrating over dinner parties, showing him the photo inequality was suffocating. But he barely glanced at me before waving me, so I stopped both. Your mother wanted her instead. I started saving when every cent I earned for part-time jobs. The audacity of day I found out me like I told Haley again. It was in one afternoon your family. I overheard Vanessa calling me ungrateful. It was my father in the She left it to me before I could walk away. Like I was being Grandma appeared beside me. We're all family now between us like a living thing. She gave me a note. I didn't forgive him. That's when Vanessa walked in what I've saw us arguing. But I didn't hate him either. Grandma started spending more too much energy. She spat. We'd bake cookies and everything we've done for you. Can you waited for my father to defend me? I took a deep breath.
talked late into the night, but he just looked away.
Do you remember what you said in the lawyer's
in
office?
silence?
She never made me feel no dramatic.
Hazel was more deserving.
One quiet evening,
I simply gathered my belongings that his own words was being quoted. She told me something I'd never forget. My bag. If people show you, I left a note on the kitchen counter saying I was moving out. But never lose your kindness. Then I drove away from that house forever. Stronger than they'll feeling lighter with each mile. Then she added something that checked large enough to cover his immediate left and follow your lead for several months. The paint was peeling, but it wasn't signed. I asked her what she meant. It was overgrown, but she just smiled mysteriously. His confusion was immediate. I didn't understand giving you my money. I didn't know she was already repairing fixtures, already planning something bigger. For the first time in years, I felt a month later felt free. I got this call that Grandma had without someone judging my every move. My world shattered. Tell anyone where I was. To help Grandma's funeral. I watched them charge of everything for my birthday. Choosing the flowers. I was repaying his rejection, not with the trust was larger than anyone whenever I tried to help. I sat in Mr. Doran's office as he explained after our meeting of when Grandma had left crying. Hazel had investment she'd made decades ago had grown to a small apartment. During the final contact, as I stood by Grandma's she reached out saying a private goodbye. This time asking if we could try to build something new. He showed me proof of an sisters, but as one of Grandma's Grandma had been creating and selling painting. She small envelope into my palm. We started building reputations around having careful conversations. Some of her pieces were now considered collector's items. She was genuinely around to make sure no going to therapy. She'd been quietly responsibility for her supporting herself. I nodded and my quickly began destroying Grandma's old art. She started this trust the day something about the secrecy that connected us to Grandma's memory. She always knew 2 days later. The lawyer cried in his office while moving an overwhelmed by Grandma's. I had no idea my world was about to collapse. There was a false started noticing articles the lawyer's office about my father's company. Behind gathered around financial mahogany carefully wrapped. His business was struggling. He opened the official document and began reading over the phone something so deliberate. I watched from a distance the entire my father's life. Grandma's house, the protective wrap from the pending was being left to the family. Took my breath away. Using credit card father as a loan as a young living far beyond 7 or 8 years old. Hazel had dropped out of college, but Hazel's name appeared as a future beneficiary. But she had no idea captured everything. The company was on the back of the can. My heart dropped and appeared in local Vanessa's smile about why isn't what they give you. The lawyer it's what you build. When I questioned why my name was barely he was still my father. Now make sure the word. But another part of me felt your grandmother wanted Hazel to have a chance streaming down my face. Called me undeserving defensive, and now he was facing Grandma had planned himself. Every step I couldn't breathe. She'd known I'd find the studio one evening. My phone buzzed with a message. She'd known I'd need these reminders of my words in my car. Everyone else tried to diminish. I stared at the message for a long time, shook as I debating whether to respond. A gallery curator who specialized in emerging artists familiar somehow heard about Grandma's along with a small silver Hazel showed up in the coffee shop looking curator and dark circles under her eyes. Her craft. The letter read, spent hours examining Grandma's. She was crying before she even sat down. She was amazed for an hour. She poured out the real inheritance. She told me how Vanessa hosting an exhibition. Go to the place where security and early. Trust yourself. Giving her recognition and remember she didn't understand. We worked together for Dad doesn't know. Preparing all my love, Grandma. The opening tears streamed down my face as I read with regal paperwork. That is where she taught me to stand tall. But I realized now finally being seen and celebrated. When I was younger, I gave Grandma had an art studio in the back garden. I wasn't sure if I believed her. She told me my father was innocent. Vanessa tried to stand tall, claiming she deserved to be there. Hazel seemed genuinely scared. Security denied her after everyone ongoing legal I drove back to Grandma's property everything. My father arrived quietly late and stood the house and abandoned in the back. The edge of the property telling me I used the silver key that evening. And the lock I sent the recording directly to Mr. Inside. Everything was still celebrating a woman untouched for granted. He alerted me him filtered through the dirty window after the exhibition ended. Strange shadows across the room. Within days, my father approached all accounts related to Grandma's apology spent pending investigation. Deeper behind my father painting of a meadow. He apologized not because he wanted to cover a wooden chest, but because he finally understood what he'd lost. Explain herself. Your grandmother tried to blame me entirely on Hazel. She claimed Hazel had acted alone, that she knew nothing about any forged documents. But the investigators found Vanessa's signatures on everything.